reference. So I'm going to talk today about my book that came out. I'll pass this around if people want to flip through the hard copy of it. Unfortunately, I only have one. They didn't give me very many free copies when it was published. Yeah, so it's freely available online to all of you. I know Ellen had mentioned saving questions till the end, but do feel free to ask questions in between. And I'm going to be asking some questions of you all as we go through. So for those of you that have taken my classes, you know that's kind of my style. So I'll be talking about my book. It came out in March. It is based off of my PhD dissertation research and is the foundation for the next series kind of set of research that I am hoping to continue here at Fletcher, and I'm currently working on some proposals for. So to give you kind of a future and a past look at this research. So I want to start off asking you all a question. Where does your water come from? Does anyone know? Nope, it does not come from the Mystic River, but it's a great guess.
Western Mass.
Right, Western Mass, from the Quabbin Reservoir, exactly. On the geologic timescales of the hydrologic cycle, absolutely. Is your water international? Right, depends on the definition of your catchment. Absolutely. So if we think large basin scale, what river watershed is the Quabbin Reservoir in? Anybody know? It's in the Connecticut River Basin. The Quabbin is in the Chukchi subwatershed, which drains into the Connecticut. So is the Connecticut a transboundary basin? Anybody have a guess? It is, actually. It is. So we have here's the Connecticut River Basin. Here's the Quabbin Reservoir right here. It is a man-made reservoir. It's on the Swift River that drains into the Chukchi. I'm just pronouncing that word wrong. But there's a very tiny little bit of the basin that is actually in Canada. So most of it is contained within the United States. And then we have a system of channels and pipelines that pump water into Boston. And so much of the water that's provided, so Medford, for example, uses water from this reservoir. Some of the other smaller communities do not, and they have local reservoirs, like Cambridge, for example. But Medford, where we are here, comes from Western Mass, which is technically in a transboundary river basin. So just to kind of situate yourself in terms of why this topic is potentially very important, even for us here, even though we just have a very, very small amount that's actually shared between the states. So how many transboundary rivers are there? So there's 312. We just added 2 more this year, actually, with this particular data set. So when I talk about transboundary rivers, we're talking about large-scale basins that drain and have their outlets to the ocean or an inland body of water or an internal drainage. So it kind of depends on the topography of the location. So this is an example in the Pacific Northwest. So we have the Columbia River Basin, their basin country unit. You'll hear me say that term. And then the basin country unit for the Columbia River Basin in the United States. So we can separate and differentiate between the spatial areas of the Columbia in Canada and the US, and this allows us to do different types of analyses with the political and institutional data that we then collect. So this is showing you the 312 international river basins across the globe. The 2 we added this year, one's the Loa River, right around here, between Chile and Bolivia. Bolivia admitted that the Salala Canal in their recent IJC proceedings was an international river, and so in order to address that change in Bolivia's positioning, we added that basin, and we also found a very small basin in West Africa that we had previously missed, just given the resolution differences with satellite data. So 312. If you're looking at this, it's just about 50% of the world's land surface is within a transboundary basin. 60% of the world's catchment flow is from a transboundary basin as well. So if you think about the magnitude of how much water, where our major population centers are located, transboundary basins are an important source of our fresh water. We can continue to think about this with respect to groundwater. So groundwater is a lot harder to map. We don't have the best, well, not quite as good of an understanding of the location of transboundary groundwaters as we do with transboundary surface waters. What we can see here is kind of the most current thinking in terms of where these are located. The boundaries for an aquifer are not these hard line boundaries. They're going to be a little bit more gray area because it's based on the geology of the location rather than the topography and the elevation. So we can draw straight lines with a watershed boundary, but these are more estimates for boundaries. So keep that in mind when you start thinking about what's transboundary or what's not. And states can often use that to determine whether or not an aquifer is truly transboundary or not, is based on where they place that border. So you can hopefully start to see some of the potential complications when we think about cooperation if one state says this is transboundary and the other state says no, this is not transboundary. So there's around 600 transboundary aquifers that we've mapped thus far. About 20% of the world's land surface is underlain by a transboundary aquifer, but these are going to become increasingly more important for future cooperation. As climate change increases, as demands on surface water increase, people readily turn to groundwater sources as their alternative supply. So we'll start to see more and more importance and effort being put onto these resources, which generally are not renewed at the capacity at which we withdraw them from. So it lends to a lot of sustainability issues and also intergenerational equity issues as well. So hopefully that kind of orients you in terms of where my research in this book really comes from. How many people have seen headlines like this or have read these quotes? Water is the new oil. The wars of the next century will be about water. Fierce competition for fresh water may well be a source of conflict and wars in the future. The consequences for humanity are grave. Water scarcity threatens economic and social gains and is a potential fuel for wars and conflict. In our most recent example by the current vice president, for years there were wars fought over oil. In a short time, there will be wars fought over water, right? We've all seen these. We've got a nice time series in terms of this conversation being held in the public space. But when was the last war over water? International wars. We're focusing on interstate wars here. Renata, you want to answer? Yeah, absolutely. So the last war that was purely over water was between Lagash and Umma 5,000 years ago, between those city-states in Mesopotamia, where the sole purpose for those states going to war was water. Water is definitely a contributor. It's a compounding factor. As we comply that with climate change, it can be a threat multiplier, but it's generally not a reason why states go to war. So we have this set of research that essentially kind of bounds and precedes my book. But essentially, and this is a data set that I work with, and some of the Fletcher students are actually in the process of helping us to update this data set so we can take a new look in the last 20 years of data. But essentially what these authors did was they looked at collecting events from 1948 up until 2008, which is when this graph ends. And they capture interactions between states over their freshwater resources. And they actually track from a scale from +7 to -7 whether or not there's conflict or cooperation happening in that individual interaction, that event that occurs. And so you can see is that more cooperation is happening over transboundary water resources than there is conflictive action. And we have very little high intensity conflicts in this lower negative section than we do more smaller scale tensions. So for example, a 1 here is just exchange of words. for example. So very mild negative events. What this essentially found was that the likelihood and the intensity of the dispute rises as the rate of change within a basin exceeds the institutional capacity to absorb that change. It's a slightly convoluted sentence, but essentially what it's saying is that having adequate institutional capacity provides the resilience for an institution to different states, their relationships, to prevent conflict from occurring. So this is the premise essentially for my research, which is that we're looking at cooperation and ensuring there's this institutional capacity, there's a cooperative process, and we can continue to support trends like this moving forward into the future. So the premise of the research. The challenge is that we don't have a really great understanding of what cooperation actually constitutes over transboundary waters. We have more vague definitions that are variable, and we'll get into that. This is one example of scholars looking at monitoring conflict and cooperation. So this is the same underlying data set of that graph that I showed you on the preceding slide. And essentially we're saying that cooperation is ranging from positive verbal exchange all the way up to unification of two different states about water. So that's how this particular model defines cooperation. You can see, looking at the graph, the total number of interactions are represented by the darkness of the color in the various basins. The negative events are the circles, the proportional symbols. And so you can see basins that have higher instances of conflict would have the larger circles. The purple or the blue color does not mean more conflict, it just means more interactions between the states. So this is one representation of how we've gone about measuring cooperation. But as you can imagine, thinking about that scale, that's a really big scale of cooperation. So just having positive verbal interactions to state unification, which has not ever occurred. There are other examples where we've tried to monitor and measure cooperation. The most prominent and more recently developed is actually through the SDGs. So I like this graphic because it puts water at the center of the SDGs, and it supports my philosophy that we can't achieve the rest of the SDGs unless we achieve goal number 6. So I know there's a lot of you that would disagree. We all have our vote on which SDGs are our favorite, but it's goal number 6. So within the SDGs, goal 6 is ensuring the availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation. Target 6.5 is the one that is particularly important for us, where it's looking at measuring integrated water resources management, including through transboundary cooperation as appropriate. This bolded phrase is measured by indicator 6.5.2. So 6.5.2 says that cooperation is measured by the proportion of transboundary basin area with an operational arrangement for water cooperation. So the question is, what does an operational arrangement for water cooperation actually mean? How are we monitoring that? And how are we encouraging states to then develop cooperative processes that meet these goals? And is that what we should be doing or should be advocating for? That's the question. So the first section of the book uses the SDGs as an example to explore that question as to whether or not we have adequate methodologies for measuring cooperation and how good of a job do they actually do. So here's an example that the book walks through looking at Bangladesh. So all you can see highlighted are the basin and aquifer country units within the country of Bangladesh, because the SDGs are a national level indicator. They don't look at transboundary basins, so you're not looking at what's in the other riparian states. Hopefully you're noting that that's a critique of this particular methodology. And then they define an operational arrangement for cooperation as A, having an arrangement, so a treaty, for example. It could even be an informal, non-binding document like an MOU. And then it has these 4 components. So there's some sort of joint body or mechanism. There's regular formal communication at least once per year. There's joint and coordinated management plan or objectives, and then there's a regular exchange of data and information, again, at least once per year. Those are their frameworks. So let's take Bangladesh then as an example, and essentially do the assessment, and we get zeros across the board in terms of the percentage of Bangladesh's transboundary basin area, so the areas that were highlighted on the map, as having operational arrangements. So if any of you are familiar with Bangladesh. Hopefully you know that there is a treaty that's signed between India and Bangladesh on the Farakka Barrage. There's several intermediary agreements that have been signed between India and Bangladesh, also on the management of the Ganges. There's a basin commission that is set up between the two different states that manages flood control, and they identify 54 different tributaries that are transboundary between the two states. And through that mechanism, there are provisions within the Farakka, or the Ganges Water Treaty for regular exchange of data and information. The Basin Commission doesn't necessarily meet every year. It kind of depends on the political relationship between the states, but generally they're meeting relatively frequently, and there is some exchange of information predominantly for flood control. There really isn't joint coordinated management plan or objectives between the states. The scope of their cooperation is quite limited in terms of what it's actually covering. So because it doesn't hit this one checkbox, the SDG says that everything's zero. And hopefully you can see why that's problematic. Essentially, we're saying Bangladesh doesn't have any cooperation. It's not effective, it's not operational. That could be particularly discouraging for states, saying that what they've done, it took 30 years to negotiate the Ganges Water Treaty. It was an enormous effort to put that through. And in some respects, it's not illustrating and demonstrating what cooperation actually is occurring, given the political context in that basin. So there's a lot of problems with how well does this actually capture the cooperation that's occurring between the states. And that's essentially the challenge that we have in the field, is that we don't have a good understanding for what cooperation actually is, and how can we then see where cooperation progress is being made and encourage states to move into an effective realm. And that's where the book then lays out these two main challenges. So the first challenge is we don't have a clear, single, unified definition for cooperation. So what does that look like? How can we measure cooperation in transboundary basins? So I just have two examples that I pulled from the literature. The first defines transboundary water cooperation as the presence of an agreement. So check the box. We have an agreement, cooperation, we're good, right? Not really. A lot of those agreements aren't being implemented. They might be narrow in scope. They're not including various actors. There's a bunch of different reasons as to why that isn't necessarily the best representation. Then we have transboundary water cooperation. Any action or set of actions by riparian states that leads to the enhanced management or development of the transboundary water body to their mutual satisfaction. So a bit more comprehensive. We're starting to see the idea of having states come to some sort of mutual agreement. They're both satisfied with that, and it's looking at the management and development. But very different definitions for what cooperation is actually encompassing. What we then see is, looking at the literature, is that many of the authors are not actually trying to define cooperation, but they're trying to see whether or not that cooperative process is successful. And that's really the core goal of what we're getting at, is if we want to be able to ensure there's adequate institutional capacity so that we can prevent future conflicts in the face of climate change, increasing demand on our resources, increasing economic development, we need effective cooperative processes. And that's really the heart of the question the book goes into answering. There are scholars that have been working on this topic. It's an important question. They're trying to see, how do we actually have effective, successful cooperative processes? So there's a couple examples here of others' perspectives. So we have here, effective cooperation provides measurable benefits to riparians that promotes water security. So it's a very particular focus on water security. Another set of authors defines effectiveness as the ability of treaties or institutions to address or manage water disputes peacefully. So water security versus managing disputes, again, two very different effective outcomes. So it depends on what you're focusing on. So these are the two scopes of the book, and if you'll notice looking through there, it's separated into parts, so part 1 and part 2. So part 1 looks at challenge number 1. How is transboundary water cooperation defined? So what I did essentially was sample a large swath of the literature to look at how do we actually define cooperation, how is it operationalized in the literature within the academic space, And then interview practitioners, so people that are river basin managers, for example, working in river basin organizations and ministerial organizations that are responsible for transboundary waters, in NGOs that advise or provide donor funds to support the development of river basin organizations, and actually went and asked them, what does cooperation look like to you or to your basin, and how can we then extrapolate that into a particular definition? So you have the top, I identified 50 core components of definitions of cooperation. Of those, you can see the top 5 separated out between the academic space and the practitioner space on the side. But overarchingly, the dominant aspects of cooperation was whether there's a treaty and agreement, mutual benefits, or whether there's institutional capacity. Institutional capacity, mainly due to that originating study that I showed you, is a really common term within this particular field. It encompasses both institutions, like river basin organizations, but it can also include legal implements as well when we talk about it here. So it does incorporate treaties and agreements as well, but often people will use it as a standalone term rather than differentiating between the two. What we found that was most interestingly, or what I found, was that the academic space, which is definitely the more dominant voice within the field, really focuses on the legal and the institutional components. Most likely that's because it's really easy to measure those versus some of the other aspects. The relationships, so you can see looking at the interviews, we have mutual benefits, basin planning, shared understandings. We're looking more at how do we create value and the relationships between the various actors come to common understanding, and that was more what they were defining as important for cooperation. And so we start to see a disconnect in terms of what the academic space is promoting and encouraging states to adapt versus what people on the ground are actually saying is important for cooperation. So this led me to create a definition for transboundary water cooperation. So interactions between actors over shared waters that result in establishing mutually beneficial outcomes through a decision-making process. This process could include formal and informal legal and institutional mechanisms depending on the scale and the context. So depending on what's applicable for that place. The challenge is this is really hard for states to actually go about and implement. It's a statement-style definition. It's quite broad. It's quite general. And so we needed another way to actually think about how could a state go about assessing what their institutional capacity is and figuring out how they can then improve that cooperative process. So I used a framing analysis. So I have a little icon up in the top to kind of represent. So we have a word cloud of all of the definitions of cooperation. If you imagine the box as a room and you're looking from an aerial view down into the room and then the sides are walls, on each of those walls you have a window. Each of those windows represents a frame or perspective of a definition of cooperation. What we end up seeing is that many definitions were taken from just a particular perspective, but we can remove the roof and look vertically down into the room, and we can get a more holistic perspective of what cooperation actually encompasses in the transboundary water space. So we have 4 different frames: legal, institutional, relational, and the outcomes frame. So again, the outcomes frame really getting at that effectiveness and success component. The legal frame incorporates whether or not there's legal elements, there's a treaty, what procedural or substantive mechanisms might be incorporated within that particular agreement. The institutional frame looks at, is there an RBO, river basin organization? What is the institutional structure of that organization? What's the scope of that organization? How is it funded? How is it financed? What are the relationships? How is the process of creating those relationships? Is there a high degree of trust between the actors? Are all the actors included that should be included in the process? And then lastly, thinking about the outcomes. So what goals do they set? Do they achieve those goals? So we can then do an assessment of a cooperative process to look at what emphasis of frame do they have in their institutional design. Are they more focused on treaties? Are they more focused on institutions, relationships, or establishing and setting goals and outcomes to be achieved? So we can do an assessment of these different types, as we'll look for various elements within the cooperative process, and we can fit them within the 4 frames. These will obviously be variable depending on the scale that you're working at and then the context. So hopefully this is applicable beyond just the interstate, even though that's where I'm coming from in the development of it, but we can look beyond that. The big piece that I think is important for this is that this is not a means to judge the cooperative process. In this case, we're calling cooperation neutral because cooperation can be both conflictive or destructive, or sorry, constructive or destructive. So essentially we're saying that, I mean, in general, when we think of cooperation, we're always like, cooperation, good, this is positive, we're making good effort. But the reality is cooperation can enshrine the status quo, it can enshrine power differentials, it could potentially lock in environmental policies or standards that are not good for the environment, they're harmful. It can lock in various social inequities. And so cooperation necessarily isn't good always. So this takes a lens that cooperation is neutral, and all we are doing is categorizing and where they have their emphasis between these four frames. The judgment piece is when we get to the effectiveness component, and that's the part two. So what makes transboundary water cooperation effective? So just like with the definitions for transboundary water cooperation, again, looked at the literature and the interviews, so for the practitioner space, to identify various aspects of effectiveness. So what words are we actually using? What are we incorporating into these understandings of effective cooperation? So you can see the top 5 separated out between the two data sources here. There's less of a difference between the two when we start thinking about effectiveness. You'll notice that achieving outcomes is the dominant space, or is the dominant aspect. Does that cooperative process actually do what it set out to do? And that's what we're defining at its core of what effective cooperation is. But you'll notice that it also incorporates the idea of institutional capacity, so the legal and the institutional mechanisms, but it's also including the relationships as being an important piece of effective cooperative processes. Many of the practitioners highlighted that they didn't think their process was effective because not all the voices were being heard in the room. So it was effective on the level that they had a treaty, they were implementing the mechanisms, they had a river basin organization, but it was ineffective because not everyone's voice was heard and contributed to that process. So we start to see a little bit of differences here. So we then create, again, a statement definition for what effective transboundary water cooperation means. So it achieves equitable results or outcomes through cooperative decision-making process that has trusting relationships with stakeholder participation and communication. The process is supported by the appropriate legal and institutional arrangements where the outcomes can be the resolution of the initial problems, reaching the goals of the parties, complying with mutually agreed upon principles, and a legal arrangement. A wordy mouthful. So I think it's much better to think about this as from a model perspective, which I'll show on the next slide. But when you look at this definition and you think about effective cooperation, there generally has to be some standard for comparison. So you could have effective cooperation that is environmentally detrimental or that's effective at marginalizing a particular group if that's what it set out to do and it achieves those outcomes. So we have to have a clear objective in which we're working towards. So I say that effective cooperation then is both equitable and sustainable. So those are the core kind of foundations that we're working towards for a standard of comparison. So this definition then we can think about from a conceptual model standpoint. On the outside, we have the system parameter. So what's the context? What scale are we looking at? What's the time frame we're concerned with? And then we have the 4 different frames of cooperation as defined from the previous framework. So those are represented by the blue bubbles here. Because we saw that in the data, the relational component and the outcomes component were more emphasized in the definitions that were given for effective cooperation, and that the practitioners in particular valued the relational components. These 2 aspects of the frames of cooperation are more important for effective cooperation than are the 2 areas that we generally have been measuring in the past, the legal and the institutional. These are necessary though, so I'm not negating them. We need adequate legal instruments, we need adequate institutions that are in place that provide the foundation to be able to achieve these outcomes and to foster the relationships and the trust. So they're all necessary, and that's why you see the various interlinkages between the bubbles. But when we're thinking about the effectiveness, if you don't have these, regardless of the legal or the institutional mechanisms you have, you're not going to have effective cooperation. So how do we operationalize this? We have a 3-stage process, which stems from the institutional effectiveness literature, looking at 3 different stages of the process for evaluating effectiveness. The first is essentially defining your system parameters. What process are you interested in? So what's the actual piece of cooperation that you're interested in? Draw the boundaries around your system. Determine the scale that you're looking at. Are you looking specifically at the interstate scale? Are you looking at the basin scale? Or are you looking at a point scale? So you're just looking at cooperation over a dam, for example. What's the political, historical, hydrological context of the place that you're in? This will be particularly important to think about. And that was going to affect the degree of effectiveness. What's effective between the US and Canada is going to be very different than what's effective between Israel and Jordan. What's your time frame? How are you bounding your comparison for effectiveness? Are you looking at a comparing point in the past? Or are you looking at comparing towards an ideal? And then lastly, doing adequate stakeholder mapping. Who are the actors that should be involved in the process? Who are relevant for cooperation, and who should we be having in the room doing the day-to-day management or the particular negotiation of an agreement? Once we have all of this information, we can run the assessment. So essentially it's creating basin-specific questionnaires or survey instruments, administering to all the actors you've identified that fit within this set of parameters, that fit within these 4 frames of cooperation. So essentially you create paired questions to allow for the comparison to determine the effectiveness. So if you've established from your time, whether you're looking at a baseline comparison or an ideal comparison, you can then establish, okay, at this point in time, what are the mechanisms in place for legal mechanisms? So do you have a mechanism for equitable and reasonable allocation? And what mechanisms do you want in the ideal, or what mechanisms did you have at some point in time in the past? And so you can establish these within each of these 4 frames. The outlier is with respect to the outcome frame, because right now we're not looking at that effective cooperation is sustainable and equitable piece. And so we need some sort of objective criteria that's not just internal to the basin. And so we'll develop standardized questions that are context specific, but they fit within the 4 frames of they fit within the 3 areas of sustainable development. So whether it's economic, environmental, or social related questions, so that we have some sort of objective measure for achieving outcomes so we can hit that goal of sustainable cooperation. So we're not just having effective cooperation that mines away our resources or over allocates our resources. Once you've conducted that assessment and that interview, then you have to go through the process of evaluating that set of data. And the methods for evaluation can vary depending upon which particular set of questions you're looking at. And so they can look at whether there's compliance, so the extent to which the process or the actors are actually conforming to the rules and obligations they set out. Are they checking those boxes? Are they meeting those goals? Did they achieve the goals that they're looking for? So you look at asking what actors have, what joint goals or expectations have they set? These might not be the specific legal mechanisms that are in place, but broader picture goals. Are those being achieved? Are they being implemented? Whose goals are being implemented? That leads us to that interest base. So you can start to assess the degree of trust or power relationships between the actors. And then whether or not the problem was solved. So in much of the effectiveness literature, that's the core focus, is problem solving. Did you set out to have a process that was about a particular problem and that was solved? The reality with water conflict, or water cooperation in particular, is that you never really solve it. We're just continuing to manage it. So the solving piece, I think, is a lot less important for transboundary waters, because we need to be able to continue to manage water cooperation or water management forward into the future. So are we establishing adequate processes that can do that, essentially? We can then assess whether it's effective or ineffective, and I specifically argue that we should not quantify this, because that implies a degree of comparison between various states. And I do not think we can adequately do that. Because of the context, what is effective in that Colombia example or US-Canada example is going to be very different to what we can see as effective between Israel and Jordan if we look at the political context of the Middle East. So we're comparing apples and oranges, and so I avoid quantitatively assessing this. So we're just looking at kind of ordinal levels here. This can all then be synthesized to see how much emphasis was put on the outcomes, how much emphasis was put on the relational components, so we can recognize that these are more important for effective cooperation. Because if you have an assessment and you see that they're doing really well here, but not so well here, on many methodologies that would be considered effective. But what we found is that's actually not as effective as we originally would have assessed. So what are the key takeaways, and why does this matter in particular? So here's just the summary of some of the key points. But the main reason in terms of why this particularly matters is because we're promoting, especially with the Sustainable Development Goals, we're promoting a particular normative framework for cooperation. It's all procedural based. It doesn't talk about any particular issues. It doesn't get into relationship building. It doesn't necessarily get into achieving outcomes, as long as you're exchanging data and you have some objectives, but are you implementing or meeting those objectives? So we're not really moving forward with process. So what we need is a framework that recognizes that cooperation is neutral, it's a process, and that we should be working towards improving the relationships and the outcomes of that cooperative process. The idea and the benefits of this particular methodology is that we're able to provide really tailored solutions for a particular state so that they can improve their particular effective cooperation. So it's meant to be a very applied framework to go in as an outside practitioner, to assess the cooperative process for those states, and to provide recommendations in terms of how do we improve the effectiveness so that we can better prevent conflict in the future. Thank you.